Well, hello again, stranger. Let's take a step back, yeah. England was nearing the conclusion of the 15th century. At the end of the long, arduous, bloody Wars of the Roses, neither of the houses York nor Lancaster stood victorious. That honor belonged to the House of Tudor, or more appropriately, Henry Tudor.
Henry Tudor, in many ways, was less a traditional feudal lord and more a political operator. He did not wait for British nobles to hand him the crown in August 1485. He earned the influence first, running a very effective propaganda machine from Brittany and France, and raised an army of mercenaries second. It was a series of calculated risks that paid off at Bosworth Field, where Richard III fell off his horse and Henry picked up his crown. This was not the strategy of a medieval monarch, it was the tactics of a medieval crime boss. His path to the throne was paved with audacity and opportunism.
Henry, a shirt-tail member of the Lancaster clan, had barely a hint of a claim to the throne, but by marrying Elizabeth of York and proving himself at the Battle of Bosworth Field, he stood victorious. Henry was able to win the crown, and the rest, as they say, is history. As many of his forebears proved, it is one thing to become king. It's something else completely to stay that way. Winter King by Thomas Penn chronicles Henry's life as the first Tudor king, from when he first unites the Roses to his last days, death, and immediate legacy. Penn carefully illustrates the paranoid, micromanagerial monarch, using all of the contemporary sources, showing his diplomatic, feudal, financial, legal, and illegal efforts to cement the Tudor house as the legitimate caretakers of the British throne, and to prove this act as the utmost benefit to the struggling England.
To secure his regime, Henry enacted laws and employed ministers who operated outside the spirit of common law, ensuring his dominance, as well as his motivations, was financial as well as military. Does that sound familiar? What year is it anyway? He infamously used bombs and recognizances, legal agreements where nobles were forced to pay staggering fines for even minor transgressions, or simply as a guarantee of future loyalty. These were not traditional taxes. They were coercive, targeted instruments of control that bled the aristocracy dry. The king's chief enforcers, Richard Empson and Edmund Dudley, became feared figures, using the judicial system to amass vast wealth for the crown and cripple any potential resistance, essentially running a protection racket masquerading as a royal exchequer. Henry treated the treasury as both a national reserve as well as a personal war chest. Again, he wasn't a traditional land-rich monarch, so he required a revenue stream outside the traditional system of taxation or parliamentary grants. He directly involved himself in English trade, utilizing the burgeoning navy and textile industry and black market trade such as the lucrative alum market. This stock portfolio portrays a king who viewed his country's economy as a personal enterprise. By the time of his death on 21st April 1509, he had amassed a personal fortune estimated to be £1.5 million, a hoard that dwarfed the finances of every other European monarchy and provided the ultimate insurance policy against internal or external threats. Behind all of the pageantry, circumstance, tradition, and tragedy lies a flawed man who inherited a flawed nation. He was constantly threatened by potential usurpers, both legitimate and pretender, as well as powerful competitors in a world that was seemingly growing larger with each new discovery in the wealthy new world. His ways of combating these competitors nowadays might seem Nixon-esque, but at the time it was nonetheless effective, and some might argue necessary. Henry concreted his reputation for implacable severity when dispatching his two most famous pretender-contenders. There was the unfortunate Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be Richard of Shrewsbury, the younger prince that disappeared from the Tower, and Lambert Simnel, who was claimed to be Edward, Earl of Warwick, who had not disappeared from the Tower and was quite locked up safe inside, until attempting to escape with the aforementioned Warbeck. Mind you, Henry's influential propaganda machine that stole favor from Richard III required to be known that Tricky Dick killed his royal nephews. So even if Warbeck was Shrewsbury, he was not, for all intents and purposes, allowed to be Shrewsbury.
The snozberries taste like snozberries.
Henry didn't just defeat these threats. He meticulously dismantled their support networks and executed the ringleaders, demonstrating a cold, calculated efficiency. Henry VII thus bequeathed his son Henry VIII not merely a massive treasury, but a frighteningly effective blueprint for absolute rule, a family business secured through legal manipulation.
Penn gives us Henry's introduction of a teenage Catherine of Aragon to his English court, the deaths of his eldest son and wife, his coddling of son Henry, the only surviving chance of a Tudor future in England, his dealings with the Italian merchants, the Pope, and his investment in an alum black market. It was the Renaissance after all, and Henry was the quintessential English Renaissance man. You'll find the rest within these pages. Of that, I'll say no more. I've been Johnny. You're always welcome in my neck of the woods. Good girl. Good job.
Thanks again, stranger, for tagging along on this blast from the past. And if you enjoyed that story, you'll probably enjoy this story that I made this decade about how the Ottoman imperial family became a family of British commoners.
I am the professor. I am the professor. I'm your host, Fat Shia LaBeouf.
Well, please, call me the professor. And you're in my dark academia.